Hey everyone, MilkMan234 here, and welcome to another episode of Forgotten Media, where I dig up some stuff you may or may not have heard of. And welcome to another installment of Mix Batch. This is a segment where I talk about several different topics that seem too short for one episode, and decide to squeeze them all into one. So let's get started. The Pagemaster, a film about the magic of books. It hasn't aged well over the years, but I still have a soft spot for that film. Although I don't consider it to be forgotten enough to be featured on this show, there is at least one topic related to the film that I'm willing to talk about. When the film came out, there was also video game adaptations based on it, released for the Super NES, Genesis, and Game Boy. Around that same time, there was also a PC game that was unique because the game actually acts as a sequel to the film. The story focuses on Richard and his friends, adventure, horror, and fantasy, traveling back to the library where they find out that Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, mostly Hyde, has kidnapped the Pagemaster and plans to become the ruler of the written world. So now it's up to Richard to stop him and rescue the Pagemaster. The game is a point-and-click adventure where you interact with objects and making decisions when talking to certain people in the game. Although I've never played the game, I'm sure it's easy to understand the controls. Click on an item or an area and something happens. It has the look and feel of the Pagemaster, but the animation is stiff, and instead of exploring new areas, we're just revisiting the horror, adventure, and fantasy sections again. Well, there are a few new things added in there, like how we get to see Frankenstein's monster, a character that was cut from the original film. And for some reason, the fantasy section has a lot more elements from Greek mythology, so you'll be encountering the Sphinx and other creatures. As for the game acting as a sequel, it's pretty lazy. Aside from just going through the same format like the previous film, Richard Tyler still has some fears, even though by now you'd think he would have been over them. Also, the title of this game is pretty cheap. It acts as a sequel, yet it's still called The Pagemaster. They could have thought of something better, like, I don't know, Pagemaster 2, the next chapter. So there you go, the Pagemaster PC game. It's not much, but if you're a hardcore Pagemaster fan, you might like it. But as for the game itself, I'm sure there's plenty of other better point-and-click games out there. The Abbott and Costello cartoon show was made by Hanna-Barbera and released in 1967, featuring animated counterparts of the famous comedic team Bud Abbott and Lou Costello. In fact, the late 60s was a time of reintroducing those classic comedians in cartoon forms, because around that same time we also got the Laurel and Hardy cartoon show and the new Three Stooges. But for now, we're just going to be looking at the Abbott and Costello one. Each episode has 4 segments, and they all involve Abbott and Costello in random situations. One episode involves them trying to capture a monster who they call Gadzuka. One involves them in medieval times slaying a dragon. One episode involves them encountering Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves, and other random adventures. And that's about it, really. As far as I know, none of their classic routines are in cartoons, since that's what made them famous for. No Who's on First, no Jonah and the Whale, no 7 times 13 equals 28, nothing. But hey, at least we get to hear Bud Abbott voicing himself in cartoon. But you can clearly tell how he's aged and not as active as he used to be.
That does it. Now you'll have to arrest him for destroying public property.
Me? How come I have to do it?
Because your fists are bolder and braver.
And yes, that's somebody else playing Costello, seeing as how the real Lou Costello passed away before the series went on the air. And, I don't know, the impression is kind of okay for me. Although I am a fan of the comedic duo in their other works, I'm not a fan of their cartoon show. It almost feels like the same episode, at least the ones that I've seen, and it just feels like every other Hanna-Barbera cartoon. The series did get a little bit of a home media release, with random episodes being packaged with other cartoons, but there never was a complete series set. So there you have it, the Abbott and Costello cartoon show. I think I'll just stick with the old Abbott and Costello show. American McGee is best known for making his twisted continuation of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, as well as his failed attempts in doing something related to The Wizard of Oz. But there was also another twisted fairy tale game that he had worked on, and that was American McGee's Grimm, a fun little episodic game where you play as this evil dwarf named Grimm, and you travel to different fairy tale stories and turn them from happy and friendly tales to more dark and twisted tales. It was first released for GameTap, and it probably would have remained obscure if it was a GameTap exclusive. But thanks to Steam, anybody can play that game. So yeah, some people know about Grimm. Well, I bet some of you didn't know that there were comics based off of Grimm. That's right, IDW made a 5-issue miniseries that began in April of 2009. Ironically, made around the same time the company celebrated its 10th anniversary. The comics act as a continuation of the game, where Grimm has succeeded in turning the realm of fairy tales into his own nightmarish realm. Now he's just bored and looking for something else to do. He later comes across a shop full of comic books and decides that they need a Grimm re-envisioning. Each issue has Grimm messing around in a different style and tone of comics. The first issue has him enter the world of superhero comics. The second one shows him messing around in a love story. The third one depicts Grimm in the days of the Wild West comics. The fourth one has Grimm enter the world of mangas, where he enters a story that is obviously a parody of Pokemon. And the last issue has him enter a never-ending comic series, in this case a parody of the Bone series, and decides to slaughter the Tumescent cash cow, as he calls it. Although the Grimm game didn't have that much in-depth story or complicated gameplay, it mostly relied on his humorous dialogue and Grimm's personality. So it was pretty easy for IDW to transfer that over in a comic book form. The art style features Grimm and his world in that blocky art style, very similar to the game's design, while providing the comic worlds with their own styles. Grimm's main goal is to travel to certain comic book themed realms and make them dark and something more to his liking. Sometimes it works, and other times they don't work. Either way, they all end up with disastrous results, whether Grimm likes it or not. And that's about it. If you're a fan of McGee's Grimm, then you'll enjoy the comics. They're not that hard to find, and they're pretty cheap for the most part on eBay. So there you have it, American McGee's Grimm Comics. A nice little continuation of the macabre dwarf. After Burton had finished working on his short film Vincent, and before he went into making the original Frankenweenie, he made a low-budget short in 1983 that was his take on the classic fairy tale Hansel and Gretel. You know, the story where Hansel and Gretel's mother leave the mountain to the forest and die, and then they find a gingerbread house owned by a child-eating witch. Yeah, that one. Around that time, Burton was interested in Japanese culture, and it clearly shows in the film because all of the actors are played by Asian actors, with some Japanese culture in Burton's design, such as seeing the father of Hansel and Gretel making toys, or how the witch uses cookies as throwing stars, or breaks her candy cane in half to make a pair of nunchucks. Another interesting thing about the film was a brief introduction by Vincent Price, one of Burton's personal idols. As you would expect from Burton, there are some creepy moments in the film, such as Hansel and Gretel being attacked by candy hands that pop up from their beds, or how Hansel is trapped in a cell while this really creepy-looking gingerbread man keeps pestering him to eat him. The film was only shown once late at night on the Disney Channel on Halloween, and after that it disappeared. For a while it was considered to be a lost film, while others just regarded it as an urban myth. Several years later, the film resurfaced again thanks to the Tim Burton Exhibition, a gallery of Burton's drawings and designs, as well as some props from films that he's worked on. This was the only way to see this film, plus looking at some of the surviving props from the film, which was a nice bonus. Then a few years later, the film would resurface again, but this time on the internet for all to see. So there you have it, Tim Burton's Hansel and Gretel. It has some interesting history behind it, and even though it hasn't aged well over time, it's definitely worth a watch for Tim Burton fans. Well, that wraps up this episode of Forgotten Media, so this is Melting Man 234 signing out.